thank you very much, and this is a fantastic turnout. I'm honored to be here. And I do have a chapter in here called Livingston Saturday Night, What Montanans Do for Fun, after the Jimmy Buffett song. But I have a bit of a cold, and I don't know how long my voice is going to hold out, so that's kind of a long chapter. I was going to read, at the risk of ruining the book, I'm going to read the afterword. And so that's not very long, and the Livingston chapter actually starts out with some talk about fiddle tunes, and I started in 1864 and sort of describe what people did for fun then, and it's really, as Andrew said, not that much different from what people do now. They like to drink, they like to listen to live music, and they like to gamble. And Montana has all three. So I did bring my fiddle. It's kind of my backup in case I bore you. Start playing a few fiddle tunes. But this is the afterword, and I called it La Gioconda Smile on the Montana Face. And I got the title, as you probably know, from Leslie Fiedler's fantastic essay called The Montana Face. And La Gioconda is the real name of the Mona Lisa, and people always talk about her little enigmatic smile. So. In 1943, the great historian T.K. Whipple, in his book Study Out the Land, in a chapter called The Myth of the Old West, offered a new variation on an old theme. While he was unwilling to give up romanticizing the West altogether, he thought that earlier versions of the myth focused too much on the great personalities, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Jim Bridger, and so on. In reality, the story of the West was comprised of a history forged by ordinary men and women. All America lies at the end of the wilderness road, he wrote, and our past is not a dead past, but still lives in us. His sentiment might very well stand as an epigraph on the story of Montana for the last 150 years. Our forebears had civilization inside themselves, the wild outside, he went on. We live in the civilization they created, but within us the wilderness still lingers. Whipple's version of the Old West myth strikes me as an improvement over previous versions that privileged the aristocratic European and the noble savage. But there's no denying the romanticism still left in it. What they dreamed, he said, we live, and what they lived, we dream. That is why our Western story still holds us, however ineptly it is told. What Montana means to us must derive in part from history, but to echo a sentiment from the introduction, a large part of what it means to us comes from those aspects of the place that have remained relatively aloof from history, those majestic mountains and endless prairies and stately waterways. 150 years have brought undeniable changes to those features, but enough of them remain undisturbed to gratify whatever inkling of the romantic remains. I celebrate the fact that I can walk from the heart of downtown Helena and in 15 minutes find myself alone, enveloped in the dusty hills of Davis Gulch, or that I can wander on foot from the gritty streets of uptown Butte and in 10 minutes find myself scrambling alone through the scrub brush on Woodville Hill, tracing the paths Mary McLean took over a century ago. The kind of romanticism I am talking about is more aesthetic than nostalgic, more informed by art or literature than history. Many historians I know have trouble getting excited about Montana history simply because it's such a narrow sliver of American history, which is a pretty narrow sliver of world history. But I think that dearth of history helps describe what, if anything, makes Montana unique against the backdrop of the rest of the country. One of the greatest contrasts operant in Montana is just this ambivalence between Joseph Kinsey Howard's 1941 observation that, quote, Montana has packed a lot of history into one century, and the realization, equally astute, that the landscape here retains the imprint of a prehistoric past. I'm no outdoorsman or bagger of peaks. I haven't field-dressed an animal since I was a teenager, and I seldom hike more than a few miles in a day. But I take immeasurable comfort in knowing that I could at any moment get on a footpath in the Swan and walk for 80 miles or more without seeing a highway or an office building. And when I emerge, perhaps somewhere around Shoto, it would not be impossible for me to walk all the way to Great Falls without seeing much in the way of buildings or people. What makes Montana so immensely valuable are all those things you can't put a price on. That comfort in relative solitude, that reassurance of knowing, as the little bumper sticker enjoins, you can still get lost in Montana. I love that the in Montana is in really small letters. Get lost. Most of the places where people live in this country are no longer places where you have that kind of luxury. People in Los Angeles have to drive a couple of hours to get to Yosemite, and once there, it's not like they won't run into a lot of other people. Look at a detailed map of the country east of the Mississippi and try to find a point anywhere that you could imagine yourself walking without hitting a road or town after just a few miles. Even the celebrated Appalachian Trail passes through some dense urban areas, and hikers are seldom out of cell phone range. The whole shittery gone by God and not to care, saving some who seen her news, says a character in A.B. Guthrie's Homage to Montana, The Big Sky. That novel is arguably the most famous book to emerge from Montana, eclipsed perhaps only by Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It, with thanks due to Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. Professor William Kittredge quoted Guthrie to have said that he wrote The Big Sky, quote, to show the way people kill the thing they love the most. Like a child with a kitten, they squeeze it to death. I would argue that Guthrie, like a lot of place-oriented romantics, suffers from an overly dramatic aversion to change. In other words, the whole shittery of Montana is hardly gone. On the contrary, it is alive and well and will probably proceed with greater health into the 21st century than a lot of its neighbors, precisely because so many people who live here and love this place are involved in taking steps to ensure that the inevitable changes coming along don't kill the thing they love the most. And as an aside, I would just compare what's going on in Montana versus North Dakota. Earlier in the book I talk about, thanks to our very strong 1972 Constitution, it probably won't happen as fast here as it did there, if at all. I would say that the most important indicators of that health are indicated in our 1972 Constitution, and in particular the provisions it made to protect the natural environment and the commitment it made to Indian culture. In a very real sense, these are the two most important elements of Montana that connect to that remote past. The fact that Montanans came together in 1972, crossing political and cultural divides, in order to articulate an enduring commitment to not simply preserving, but cultivating these two aspects of Montana, hold, at least for me, the promise that, as William Faulkner said about humanity in general, we will not merely endure, but prevail. As much as I like A.B. Guthrie and the inimitable power he had as a storyteller, I have to part ways with him when it comes to assessing the past and envisioning the future. In 1864, the country was still young. It hadn't even been together as a union for a single whole century. But the country to the west, the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains that are the backbone and the soul of Montana, were already very old, even if the new wave of civilization sweeping over it was merely in its infancy. The elasticity of terms like old and new betray our inability to conceive of ourselves as part of geologic time. Time measured in millions of years. Because Montana lies at the intersection of so many versions of time, geologic, cultural, historical, our state is a fertile ground for the imagination, as evidenced in the plethora of writers who call it home. The ambivalences that course through our brief measure of historical time often result from the difficulty we have in maintaining philosophical perspective. If Bud Guthrie was Montana's Empedocles, the philosopher who resisted change and threw himself into a volcano to immortalize himself, then I have to prefer Norman Maclean, who strikes me as much more a version of Heraclitus. Like Maclean after him, Heraclitus was, quote, haunted by waters, most probably because they represent the fundamental quality of existence itself, change. The first impulse of the philosopher confronting change is to deny it, to concoct some clever proof of change as illusory, perhaps in accordance with some romantic yearning to hold on to the moment of twilight that bathes all things in the most perfect light. But Heraclitus wisely chose not to deny change at all, but to recognize it as the fundamental condition of life. He recognized that all things flow like water, and one can't step in the same river twice. I asked a lot of people in the last year this question: do you think things are better now than they were in 1864? It's one of those questions that leads to a lot of interesting answers. It's so vague that people find themselves pursuing unpredictable avenues in trying to formulate an answer. But no matter how you parse it, for most people it boils down to a series of trade-offs. On the one hand, we have far better healthcare and technology, but on the other hand, we've lost a lot in the way of freedom and privacy. Other people avoid the judgment involved, whether moral or aesthetic, and simply approach it in terms of difference. Things aren't better or worse now, they're just different. I was curious to hear how a Montana Indian would respond to the question. I started with my friend Earl Veal of Blackfeet from Browning, who has ancestors who were also Gros Ventre. We met for coffee one afternoon in Great Falls. Mostly we talked about our families, our jobs, and how we've lived in different places in Montana, and what those places mean to us individually. Earl towers over me. He must be 6'8" to my 5'9", and he used to be a boxer. He told me of his days as a bouncer at the old Silver Spur Bar in Helena, just down the street from where I grew up. I was surprised to hear the name of that bar, and as he told a story about working there, I remembered all the hundreds of times as a kid I walked down the alley behind the old Quonset hut with the big neon-lined cowboy boot above the door on my way to Lincoln School. I realized, like a lot of landmarks from those days, the Silver Spur had disappeared. I asked him whatever happened to that place. He laughed. It's sitting in a field out in the valley there beyond Helena somewhere. They moved it to make way for the Mountain West Bank. After a while, we got around to my question. Better or worse? Earl mulled it over for a few moments. I don't know. 1864? That's a tough one. That was before we were on the reservation. The buffalo were still there. That's before the Baker Massacre. I can't say things have gotten better since then. No. He doesn't elaborate, but then he doesn't have to. We move on to other things and talk about books for a while, and then we both have to get back to work. For American Indians in the East, even those tribes from as close to Montana as Minnesota or Kansas, by 1864, the damage had been done. The homeland lost and overrun. But in 1864 in Montana, the Blackfeet were rulers of a vast territory that stretched from Saskatchewan and the Dakotas to central Montana. Things would not get any better than that for a long time. 6 years later, the Baker Massacre would snuff out the lives of 173 women and children and kill the spirit of a whole people. Another smallpox epidemic would rage through the tribe in central Montana and kill 600. Within 25 years, the plains would be littered with the rotting corpses of the last buffalo and the remaining Blackfeet sequestered on the reservation. I also posed the question to Brandy Foster, a woman I grew up with in Helena, who is now the director of American Indian and Minority Achievement for the Montana University System. She's Iowa, Sac, and Fox. She considered my question for a minute or so, and then agreed with those who deemed it a meaningless question. Especially from the specific point of view of someone who is Indian, she said. But to say that things are just different is too bland an assessment. She thought for a moment and then said, I compare my life to my great-grandmother's life. Her life was simpler, more connected to community, to the earth, no question. But there are trade-offs. We have greater access to technology, more access to health care, etc. But her life was more authentic, if that's the right word. Authentic is probably exactly the right word. Existentialist philosophers seized on the word authentic for similar reasons. For them, it described a life lived in accordance with one's own spirit, no matter what forces might impinge from the outside. There's a big difference between judging some arbitrary past time as better than the present and acknowledging that that earlier period was more authentic. The former approach is simply romanticism exposed, but the latter conveys a maturity one has to possess in order to adequately confront the future. Authenticity is tied up in practice, in the way we actually live our lives, enmeshed in the fabric of the landscape. It's a function of the times we live in and in the manifold culture we inhabit. My goal in this book has been to show that recapturing that authentic aspect of life may not be so far out of our grasp in Montana as it is in other places. As we turn the corner on 150 years, it's probably a worthy occasion to sit back and think about where we've come from, the ground we've covered, and where we'd like our children's children to be in another century and a half. Last night, my wife and daughter took me to dinner and a movie in the heart of Helena's new Northern Town Center. I guess it's not that new anymore, it's been there 10 years. New to me. When I was a kid, this section of town was a grimy industrial corridor, replete with railroad tracks and hobo camps. A bottling plant and a junkyard used to sit where the exploration works and the carousel are now. Walking south toward the new Cinemark Theater, which can't be too far from where the old Quonset hut of Capital City Bowl used to be, we passed through a few blocks of gentrified shops and restaurants arranged behind prefab boulevards with faux industrial signs above their doors. Aside from the December in Montana chill in the air, I wouldn't be able to distinguish this section of town from Pearl Street in Boulder, or Portland's Southwest District, or Five Points in Atlanta, or any other rejuvenated, trendy business district in any number of American towns. For that matter, Montana Avenue north of the railroad tracks looks just about like Missoula's Brooks Avenue, or 10th Avenue South in Great Falls, or any other box store and fast food lined avenue in America. Most of us live in a homogenized landscape with a McDonald's at every interstate interchange and a Walmart on the edge of town. It's impossible to deny that Montana has escaped this trend. I'm reassured by the fact that in 1864, most places in the country also looked alike. The buildings were brick or false wood fronts, the roads were dirt, the advertising signs all shared a similar style. People followed the New York styles then, as they do now, even if the aesthetic was a little different. Nowadays, our iPhones and laptops interface seamlessly with cable television, speeding communication, but also hastening our cultural flattening of affect. We can message a friend on the other side of the planet, but we wander through America more lonely than we probably should be. Every street in America looks the same in an unfamiliar way. Again, a person feels this sort of dislocation with less force in Montana. Even though I'm standing in a neighborhood in Helena that's trying maybe too hard to be Soho, I know that the rest of the world hasn't reached Montana yet, or at least not entirely. Our story is so recent, so shallow, that you hardly have to dig before reaching bedrock. Our proximity to the past here keeps us closer to each other than in other places, more in touch with 1864 than we might imagine. A brief glance back across the last century and a half can be both comforting and unsettling, which probably reflects some fundamental quirk in the way we think about time and the unavoidable effect it has on us. The older we grow, the more we find ourselves looking back, trying to recapture ourselves in an earlier age. Our personal memories of our families, our neighborhoods, our experiences provide us with some kind of entry into the collective past we all share. I doubt that I'm alone in admitting that as a child I looked at old family photos and just assumed that my grandparents and everyone before them lived in a world that was black and white, just like the photographs. And even though we're often wrong in our basic assumptions about what life was like for people living 150 years ago, the pleasure of reading about them in part consists of recognizing that we always have more in common with them than we think. Our worries, our delights, our problems, our philosophies differ from those of our forebears in degree, not kind. The circumstances may be different, but the people in them we always recognize as our own. One change certain to come to Montana in the next 100 years, even in the next 20, is a considerable increase in population. When I was younger, I used to sympathize with the bumper sticker that said, "Montana is full, I hear Idaho is nice." And most of the people I grew up with, I'd complain about all the Californians and New Yorkers moving in. But one day it occurred to me that where you're born is an accident of fate and hardly any kind of entitlement. To complain about an influx of Californians in Missoula or Bozeman exposes you as a chauvinist. But only a fool would try making that argument on a street corner in Browning or Poplar. Imagining what Montana will be like in another 150 years poses an even greater puzzle than trying to make sense of our past. Social scientists suggest that one of the most vexing aspects of trying to respond to impending global climate change comes from the fact that human beings seem cognitively unable to think more than a generation ahead. In other words, even though we seem to be able to look backwards with relative ease, we have profound difficulty thinking about a future any more distant from us than what things might be like for our children. The study of history, coincidentally, demonstrates that almost no human community has ever planned concretely for a future beyond a generation. Perhaps two at the most. So it seems that when we speak of future generations, the people we are thinking of are our children, maybe our grandchildren if we have them. Beyond that, the vision gets too abstract for us to change our behavior for their benefit. Cynics like James Howard Kunstler, author of The Geography of Nowhere and the Long Emergency, Surviving the End of Oil, Climate Change, and Other Converging Catastrophes of the 21st Century, paint a depressing picture of a world without oil, a landscape ravaged by global warming. Even if you buy this grim scenario, the news for Montana actually doesn't look so bad. We might see an incredible rise in population, but at least the weather should be better. Some models suggest that Montana will become much more temperate and rainy. Optimists, on the other hand, like the popular science writer Matt Ridley, author of The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves, lose patience with this doomsday crowd. What's interesting is that the optimists tend to reassure us about our future by reference to the past. Humans are, by their very nature, incredibly adaptive. Mammals in general are adaptive, but we've taken the skill to impressive heights. And the optimists project that whatever challenges the future brings, we'll survive, even prevail. This also applies in a relevant way to Montana. For example, I think a lot of Montanans seldom let themselves get fazed by winter weather that makes people in other parts of the country shiver just thinking about. In part, I think that sanguinity about weather stems from our sense of the past. The winter of 1988-89 may have been exceedingly brutal, but knowing that our ancestors endured something much worse a century earlier, and without the technology we possess now, makes us less likely to bemoan our present fate. I talked earlier in the book about the horrible winter 1885-86 where all the cattle died. You know, you've seen that famous Charlie Russell painting of the cow. It looks like a skeleton with some leather over his bones. 150 years down the road remains a mostly unimaginable destination, even if the journey ahead is inevitable. But since no one of us now living is likely to be around for the tricentennial, it will be our responsibility in the interim to make note of our present, preserving our sense of it for the new arrivals as they appear. Philosophers and historians both admit that the present is moving always and irrevocably away from us into the past. We are condemned to live in the continuum of time. 150 years hardly registers on that continuum, but it's enough to hint that while circumstances and culture can change rather fast, the things that make us human tend to change imperceptibly and over the span of geologic time. History is merely the cultural gloss we put on the brief sliver of time we're fortunate enough to call our own. And that's how I ended this.